maybe it was a good thing that the Brexiteers actually won, because quite frankly, if this is how they act when they've won, then I'd hate to see how they would have acted if they had lost. And I don't know if you know what coping is. Coping is, of course, this um, trendy word the kids are now saying online on the internet to really depict someone who basically is either lost massively and he's desperately trying to cope with that fact that they've lost or something like that. And it was um, very much came into vogue, shall we say, during the last US presidential election, where everyone's saying, look at all these Trump voters coping with their loss. However, the Brexiteers are on a completely another foot. They won their little referendum, and they've forced through what they were saying at the time was their perfect vision of Brexit. But all is not really going well. Even today, we just had the Express come out admit that the EU was doing far better in trade than we were, which doesn't really jive when the Express has been cheerleading since 2016 and before that about how much this was going to supercharge UK trade. And today, of all things, we've got a very, very interesting article in City AM by a by an author who used to write for the very, very pro Brexit blog, Brexit Central, which, by the way, hasn't posted an article in almost over a year at this point, which just shows you how little good news there has been over Brexit. Because as we've said before, if there was good news about Brexit, they would almost be certainly crowing about it. So before we do jump into this article, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And also down below, there are links to my Patreon page and one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do support the channel that way. So let's have a look at how this Brexiteer indeed is currently coping. And of course, he's going to blame everyone except, well, the Brexiteers. And trust me, we are going to see some serious cope here. So this comes from City AM with the title, "The Brexit jury is still out as we fail to grasp the vision of freedom we were promised." And yet you've got to remember at the moment, this guy was one of those people promising that freedom, saying how wonderful Brexit was going to be. He was a guy who was writing for Brexit Central. It's David Collins. He wrote for Brexit Central, bragging about how wonderful Brexit was going to be. So since leaving the EU, there is no doubt that the UK has made, quote, impressive progress in signing free trade agreements. We haven't signed a single free trade agreement. Let's put that in. Including not only the rollovers of EU agreements with like those of Canada, Turkey, but entirely new ones with Australia and New Zealand. Those have not been signed yet. We do not know the details of what is going to be in those. For all we know, those could be absolutely awful. And from the stuff that we've heard, rumored, especially in the Australian one that's going to come first, it does not look good for farmers who this guy probably promised was going to be a land of milk and honey if they voted for Brexit. But like I say, we haven't signed any free trade deals yet. We've only signed rollover agreements, which were basically lesser versions than the one we did when we were in the EU. You notice that, for example, he hasn't mentioned the Japan trade deal. I wonder why that might be. Was it because that the deal we signed with Japan was actually worse than the deal we had when we were in the EU with them? And of course, the UK's application to join the CPTPP, the mega regional trade agreement, is also well underway. And underway, how? We don't know, because as we said before, why on earth are these countries going to let us join this bloc when they're all the way over on the far side of the world, we're on here? The distance just does not factor into this. It just does not make sense to be joining that bloc when we could join a far closer one, which we know has proper economic benefit for us. And remember, joining that bloc does not get us any, will not replace what we've lost when we left the EU and the Single Market and Customs Union. So it's hard to imagine that the EU would have been able to conclude so many FTAs so quickly. We haven't signed any free trade agreements. We have not signed any free trade agreements. And you do not do free trade agreements this quickly. The average free trade agreement takes between about 8 to 10 years to actually do. So the fact that these have been done at speed should be incredibly worrying. So the crucial question, of course, is whether these deals will make up for the shortfall in reduced trade with the EU, which, thanks in large part to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, has not been as severe as many predicted. Remains to be seen. It still has had a massive effect, but it ain't going to replace them. Economists have already weighed in on this. Since the EU's portion of the UK trade has been steadily declining for years, and EU compromises an ever smaller component of the global economy. Again, not true. That's a fancy myth that the Brexiteers always like to say, that the EU economy was shrinking while the global economy was getting bigger. Yes, the global economy was getting bigger, but that also so was the other EU portion. And the fact that these other economies were growing, and the fact that the EU was still very big player, meant that we could still play on that world stage. By ourselves, we can't play the big boy as we used to anymore. The UK's global trade volumes under various FTAs and WTO rules are now positioned to grow in the longer term. Interesting, because all the Brexiteers said we would see instant success. Very interesting. Of course, outside of the EU's tariff zone, many goods are now cheaper than they used to be were before. No examples I'm noticing. Even if COVID-induced inflation has mutated those gains. Oh dear. Blaming COVID for this. No. Again, you've got no evidence that prices have fallen. So, of course, the greatest opportunity for Brexit was not about free trade, but escaping the clutches of the EU's costly anti-business regulatory control. The burden of complying with EU rules was estimated to cost the UK 33 billion per year in lost productivity. The UK was not less productive because it was in the EU. When we were in the EU, we had an incredibly low productivity. Germany, Belgium, Spain, France all had higher productivity. In fact, most of the European countries have a vastly higher productivity than we do. That was not because we were in the quote unquote anti-business regulatory control of these things. But of course, you've got to remember, this comes from the same rhetoric that Britannia Unchained came from, calling the British worker the most lazy in the world because they were protected by EU worker rights. But of course, frustratingly, a year on from Brexit, we have seen very little evidence of the UK adopting a streamlined, permissive approach to regulation distinct from the EU's prescriptive, prohibitive one. And again, pushing for the low tax, low regulations Singapore on the Thames, which, if the Brexiteers had been honest at the referendum and pushed for that, no one would have voted for it. They specifically said at the referendum, we ain't going to leave the single market customs union, but here we are today. And of course, here we are attacking net zero. The UK's, quote, uncosted plans for achieving net zero to arrest the climate change seems even more draconian than those of the EU, with its, quote, unscientific devotion to the precautionary principle of the anticipated commercial nimbleness of the once described as Singapore on the Thames. I told you it was coming. I told you that would get in here somewhere. That's unbelievable that you would mention that. Saying that net zero, that it's uncosted or not worth doing. How about all the climate stuff that is going to massively negatively affect the UK, which would cost even more than not doing anything? Again, these people who wrote this are completely loopy. So, anyway, it has failed to materialise in quote of a business as usual Brussels lethargy. The ambitious free ports initiative designed to cut red tape for traders appears to have faltered. Free ports are not going to work. We've done this song and dance before. We've talked about this before. Margaret Thatcher set up free ports. They all failed, bar the ones in Sunderland and, of course, the Isle of Dogs down in London. The Isle of Dogs basically got the London airport. And, of course, Sunderland, Nissan moved there. Oh, dear. While it was wise to pull back on the HS2, what happened to the useful infrastructure projects like the Crossrail and, of course, the third runway at Heathrow? HS2 would have been far, far more better and useful to the country than a third runway at Heathrow and Crossrail. And, of course, inexplicably, business stifling taxes are at their highest level for more than 50 years. And let's not forget that the promise that Brexit would secure our borders. Illegal immigration across the Channel is at its historic worst. Again, not fulfilling out for you. First of all, we've just come through the pandemic. This country is in desperate need of more tax revenue because we've heavily slashed public services and that of the NHS as well. There is money out there. This guy will probably be very happy to tell you that Britain is one of the richest countries in the world, yet shockingly, the Conservatives are very, very, very reluctant to go after all that money which we could get in tax revenue and spend it on the UK in infrastructure spending, welfare spending, so that people aren't having to rely on food banks, and we could get out once again of child poverty like we were. So much stuff we could do with that increased tax revenue, but the Conservatives just will not go after it. And of course, this is the best one. So is this the Brexit Britain voted for? I said it would come sooner or later. Despite the weak progress to date, arguably caused by in part COVID, again, blaming COVID for Brexit, there are glimmers of hope. A quicker vaccine rollout coupled with measured response to COVID restrictions may yet yield a faster post-pandemic recovery than on the continent. Again, not according to the experts, which are saying, while this potentially may slow down, after the pandemic recovery to start, the fact that our supply chains are going to be heavily impacted by, of course, Brexit, are going to heavily slow down our economic recovery. Once again, we will be the sick man of Europe. The overdue implementation, of course, the smart borders to reduce the trade friction is encouraging. What smart borders? That is, of course, the sci-fi technology that they've said exists but doesn't. And of course, the CPP extension is hopefully imminent. Don't think so. Exports of financial services, including to the EU, which have actually increased despite the predictions of the city's collapse. Again, the export services and financial services have been affected. Not as much as, of course, that they were going to collapse, but they have been affected. We've been over this before in other articles. Of course, earlier this year, the Task Force for Innovation, Growth and Regulatory Reform, of course, led by the ERG, drew up the attention to improvements in the laws covering areas such as fintech, gene editing, which may yet gain traction. Again, this was very much the fanciful group who also said that we should be cutting things like the Working Time Directive and things that did protect workers in their jobs. A very, interesting task force recommendations. Again, noticing he's not mentioning those. So overall, a year on, was Brexit a success? No. And of course, we get that old chestnut. It's still too early to tell. Ask again in 5 years. And of course, it's never, ever going to be a success. We've done this song and dance before on this channel. We've listened to the experts. We know what's going to happen. And they've proved out to be right. Brexit has not been a success. COVID is going to take its toll. We're going to be here 5 years on, and yet this guy will probably happily say, oh no, it's going to take another 5 years. And then 5 years after that, it's going to take another 5 years, because Brexit will never, ever be allowed to fail in these people's eyes. It will eventually take proper public pressure, and they will still be saying that Brexit didn't work properly because they didn't do X, Y, and Z, or, oh, if only they had listened to me, then Brexit would have worked. Of course, they will never, ever, ever admit that Brexit was a failure. So, as always, thank you very much for watching, and please do remember to hit that like, share, subscribe button on your way out. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page and a one donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, we'll see you all next time.